In today's painting, this is one from imagination. I'm starting with a chip brush, and the mixture is a combination of ultramarine blue and burnt sienna. Sometimes it helps just to lay some paint down. I'm using today an 11 by 14 canvas panel. Painting indoors on my Maybeth French easel. What I'm doing right here is just establishing the horizon line, where the landscape is going to be placed, and how much of the painting is going to be dedicated to the sky. There, I'm just beginning to try to find some abstract shapes and forms that will eventually become my trees. Like many painters, I begin with my darks and then work towards the lights and then finally end with details. One thing I want you to notice is how these abstract shapes can quickly become forms that are recognizable without much detail. I'm still using my dark mixture, taking some time to think about what I'm going to do on the canvas today. Here, I'm taking a shop towel and using it to form some of my shapes and to work on a few tonal values. I'm primarily thinking about how the viewer is going to enter the landscape. In this case, the viewer is going to enter the landscape from the bottom middle and be escorted through the scene, past some of the trees in between. I want to establish some distance. Here, I'm now taking some of these abstract forms and using the paper towel to soften my edges. This will give an illusion of details and leaves that you really can't get with a brush. So now you see a little bit of the trees coming together and how they're attached to the ground. In some respects, I'm playing with the paint right now, seeing what I like and don't like. If I need to erase something, all I need to do is take the paper towel and use it as an eraser. This particular panel has an underpainting, and for the underpainting, I used a very light mixture of burnt sienna. This often helps so that there's at least some kind of color underneath all the other colors that will be placed on the painting. I did that a number of days ago to allow the underpainting to completely dry before painting on top. Every once in a while, I'll take a break from painting to just get back from the painting, look over my design, begin to think about why I was drawn to the scene, and how I might use abstract shapes to create the appearance or the illusion of detail. Now I begin to put some color. This is a mixture of titanium white and ultramarine blue. In many respects, painting is not just a matter of putting down particular shapes, but also painting in a negative way by taking away some of the design that's already been laid down. Here you notice what I'm actually doing is cutting into the dark shapes I've already placed on the canvas. I believe this brush is a hog's bristle brush, and I'm beginning with the largest brush I have, which is an 8 for this painting. That allows me to really concentrate on the larger shapes and not to think too much right now about detail. The brushes will get smaller as we get closer and closer to the finished painting, and it's necessary to go in with details. This time I want to take the blue and make sure that it goes all the way across the canvas in some way, helping to once again establish the horizon line. I'm also beginning to think about my focal point. The focal point is going to be the cropping of trees that you see in the middle towards the right. Artists often talk about dividing your canvas into thirds. This way, you can pick a point on the thirds where naturally the attention will lie. I'm thinking about the sky now, and the fact that as you get closer to the horizon line, the lighter the color of the sky is. And of course, as you look more directly up, you will notice that the blue becomes a little darker. So right now, I'm just laying in the initial color. I'm also cutting around the tree shape. It's a good habit not to paint directly into each color yet. In essence, I will be mixing a lot of these colors on the canvas itself. I'm trying to also vary my brush strokes, turning the brush in different ways so that the finished painting will have a sense of spontaneity and variety in brush strokes. It's important to start with paint that is relatively thin. I thin my paint using a little bit of Gamsol. And soon I will be mixing in a little bit more ultramarine blue. To establish a little bit darker shade at the top of the atmosphere in the sky. This will also give the sky a little bit more variety in color. I particularly like painting landscapes where there is some atmosphere, clouds, colors, something to break up the monotony of just a blue background. Even on days when it is just blue without any clouds, I will tend to put them in. I will also change a little bit of the color. Otherwise, I would move the horizon line towards the top of the painting so that the sky is less prominent. In this painting, the sky is not going to be the focal point, but I do want it to give a sense of movement. This painting I've entitled Laundry Day, and I'm thinking about the wind, how the wind is necessary to dry things, the power it holds, how it feels, as it hits you in the face. And somehow I wish to communicate those feelings through the brushstrokes and the colors and the shapes. Here, remember, I am simply putting down color to cover the canvas as quickly as possible. I'm letting that set up and dry just a little bit, and then eventually I will come back to that sky, blend in the two distinct blues that you now see, so that there's a seamless transition between the two. Then I will eventually add some clouds. Now I'm turning my attention to the darkest parts of the painting. Now I'm making my mixtures for the green trees, made from ultramarine blue as well as Hansa yellow. I'm mixing them on my palette first, and then I'll begin applying to my abstract shapes. I'm concentrating on making two variations of color: a darker green to represent the shaded or shadow areas, and then a little bit lighter green to emphasize where the sun is shining. I'm using a number 6 hog bristle brush. And now I'm applying various brush strokes, trying to make sure not to repeat the same stroke over and over again. I'm thinking about where the shadowed areas in the abstract forms lie, from reference photos and other studies I did on this location, and translating them now into the studio work. These shapes themselves are abstract shapes. I'm not worrying about trying to paint detail yet. I'm simply working on making sure that the color is close enough to what I saw. Again, I'm thinking about the focal point and making sure that the middle clump of trees will stand out somewhat from the other two. Taking care that each of the strokes is placed down and left alone at this point. You'll notice how ugly the shapes are at this point. Many times our paintings as we start look very ugly, and we think that we need to start again, or that we should focus on details in one section before moving on to another section. But it's much more beneficial to be painting over the entire canvas, to remind ourselves that in order for us to make a beautiful painting, we first have to concentrate on the larger shapes, and then begin switching from our larger brushes to our smaller brushes as we progress. Here, I'm going with the lighter shade of green. The difference is very small, and so you don't really notice the difference on the video. It's also an important lesson in the realization that our cameras are simply not as good as we imagine at capturing color differentiations. It's why it's so important to go out in the field and paint outdoors. Even if you paint larger works or other paintings inside, you need the experience outdoors to be able to see and to realize the differences in what is being left out of your reference photos, which should be done by yourself rather than using reference photos from others. Here, once again, there is a slight difference in these greens, and that's important. In nature, there is not a very wide variation of color in trees or in other objects. It's a fine line, a balancing act, to get shadows and lighted areas to work one another without introducing too bright a color, especially at the very beginning of a painting. Here, once again, trying to provide variety in my brush strokes as I simply cover the canvas and focus on these large shapes. No detail work has been started yet. Pausing periodically to take a look at the shapes, my design, and any changes I might decide to make. Mixing colors on the palette, and then begin applying them to the painting itself. I'm now beginning to think about the ground plane. I've a sense established the ground by painting brown, which was mainly a mixture of burnt sienna and some ultramarine blue. Now I realize that this is the second lightest plane of the painting, the sky being the first. This green has to be lighter than what I placed in the trees. It's receiving more light, and that light's being reflected up. So its tonal value is still darker than the sky, but certainly not as dark as the tree shapes. I'm using that same basic color and simply providing variations of my brush strokes as I move closer and closer to the bottom of the painting, or the area that's actually closer to the viewer. It's important to realize that the base of the painting is closer to the viewer, and therefore the color red will be more dominant in some of these mixtures, for colors begin to drop out as you move towards the horizon line. Once again, this green cannot be too light. There has to be a relationship between the trees. You'll notice in nature, in painting outdoors, that the changes of color are quite subtle. When we begin painting, we tend to think that we need to make them more dramatic. Nothing could be further from the truth. Relationships are better formed by noticing how little paint it takes to change the value or the tone of a color. Right now, you'll notice that if I had concentrated on these large shapes and thought too much about detail, I might have just started over. These forms don't look all that interesting right now to me, and even as I look at them, I contemplate whether or not I should paint parts of them out. But I withhold my urge for detail. Now I begin to think about some orange. How can we get some orangish browns in the painting? I'm thinking about bare patches in the grass, places where the grass is wilted, where the ground is still visible. How the sunlight affects some of the colors as it shines down, and the shadows. I'm trying to establish the fact that these trees now are attached to something. They're attached to the ground. I'm also thinking about how to make these brushstrokes both interesting as well as a lead in for the viewer to come into the painting and explore. So I'm conscious of the lines that are being formed at this point and how they move the viewer from the bottom or base of the painting into and around these shapes. There's a little bit of detail beginning to emerge as each stroke mixes somewhat with the green grass that I have already planted, suggesting the variations that you will find in a landscape, from the hills and the valleys to the pathways to where the rain tends to run, where there's more vegetation than others. Now that the sky has dried for a little while, I begin to mix these two colors so that you get a sense that the sky is changing in the intensity of blue without calling too much attention to the area where it is being mixed the most. I'm taking a hog hair brush, number 6 at this point, and quickly extending it across the painting from the top down. And now I will take and draw the lighter blue up towards the top, making this edge of the line less noticeable. Once again, I'm trying to vary my brush strokes, turning the brush in circles, passing over and blending so that it looks more natural and random, like you would find in nature. I'm happy with that. The painting is beginning to come together. While the shapes of the trees still look rather awkward, go in nature and you will find that trees come in many shapes and sizes. And what we tend to think of trees within our brain do not make good paintings. It is the oddness of the shapes, how they don't respond in ways that we would think they should, that actually draws us to them. I'm now taking a shop towel and forming a small pattern on it, taking just an edge, and now lightly tapping and touching on the edge of the green shapes, the abstract shapes, to pull some of the color up and away from the masses and into the blue sky. At the same time, accidentally and on purpose, pulling some of the blue back into the green, creating the effect that some of the air is moving between these branches and the leaves. Not thinking at all about sky holes, and yet at the same time being able to make them with ease. This is the best technique I have found that actually seems to create a more realistic view of the tree edges than what I often observe in other paintings. The blob is not so much a blob of green anymore, but a mixture of dark greens, light greens, without edges. A sense of the wind that I had spoken about as part of the subject of this painting, as it moves through the branches and the leaves. I'm hoping that this helps the viewer experience that movement of wind, thinking about how they have observed it themselves in nature. Here, now another shape of trees, lightening the edges, hoping for randomness, not thinking about detail, simply pushing down and pulling up, twisting ever slightly, but not too much, so I do not remove all the work, or the paint that I put down earlier. I step back. I'm pleased with the abstract shapes that have been created at the edge, how it becomes more lifelike, more tree-like, against the blue background, even as well as the ground plane. I'm beginning to think about what this painting now needs. While I think these shapes are wonderful, the focus point is clearly not in view yet. Nothing is standing out from the other shapes yet. Work needs to be done to draw the viewer in. I'm beginning to mix some other colors. I'm thinking about branches. While these abstract forms work, I believe they need more definition. But before I do that, I've decided to place some clouds in the sky to finish off that layer first. On this particular day, and with this sky, the clouds are small that are in the distance. And when they are closer to the horizon line, the clouds need to be smaller shapes. I'm lightly touching the titanium white, which has been mixed with a small amount of Hansa yellow to create a sort of light and yet warm feel. The Hansa yellow provides the warm feel that I'm looking for. Titanium white by itself is too white. It reads too cold. And this is a summer day. The clouds get bigger as they approach the top of the painting because that is closer to the viewer. And now, as I put just a few strokes, I then go back over with the brush to lighten the edges. I'm careful to make sure that we have some clouds coming in from the sides as if they extended past the painting canvas. This allows the viewer to notice how real these look. Many artists forget about the need to expand beyond the canvas, and then their clouds look artificial. I'm stepping back to take a look at these clouds. Perhaps there's too many, perhaps not enough. Actually, I'm satisfied with this number, and I'm going to stop for now. Even with these small shapes, notice how realistic the painting already is. I'm thinking about how to make the tree shapes even more like trees. I've settled on a dark mixture of the ultramarine blue and the burnt sienna to create shapes of the branches and trees. But first, I'm going back to the land plane, which once again has to be lighter than the trees, but not as light as the sky. I'm creating more edges with colors that are found in the land. Applying some yellow ochre, some burnt sienna, and various mixtures to give a sense of variety to the grasses. Making sure that there's no one place in the painting where all you see is one color. The eye finds more stimulating colors in relationship with one another. And so I'm making sure that these brush strokes provide some places for you to think and rest. Now I'm thinking about the foreground. The fact that the shapes, even of grasses, must now extend upwards as it's closer to the viewer and helps to create the illusion that the horizon line is far away. I'm varying my brushstrokes again to provide variety, a sense of randomness that one finds in nature. Now I'm taking the time to mix some of the colors on the palette. Here I'm taking some burnt sienna, a little bit darker mixture with the yellow ochre, to give a sense that these trees are really connected to the earth and to the dirt itself. Varying my brushstrokes along the bottom edge to give a sense that these shapes are not disconnected from the land, but are in harmony with it, just as the branches and the leaves are in harmony and even mixing with the sky. Thinking about the fact that the wind is creating this. Notice how little color has to be applied for it to break up the greens and to provide variety for the eye. Even at this point, I'm thinking I can always go back and fix something, change it up if I need to later. Everything is more of an experiment at this point. I could still wipe down parts if I need to. I'm putting a little bit more of the darker brown in the foreground now, using upward strokes to indicate the fact that this vegetation is closer to the viewer. Pretty soon I'll be making the mixture for the tree trunks and the limbs. That mixture will be made out of ultramarine blue and burnt sienna. I use a limited palette of colors. Hansa yellow, yellow ochre. For my reds, alizarin crimson, cad red light. For my blues, just ultramarine blue usually, sometimes some phthalo blue, but lately I'm not using it at all and have never really used it much in painting. It seems a little too unnatural for me and too strong. It tends to bleed into everything else. And then titanium white, burnt sienna. Here I'm taking that dark mixture and beginning to work on the tree. I'm using a rigger brush, a Princeton Aspen rigger, a synthetic blend that makes wonderful lines. I'm pulling these lines from the ground up, bearing down more the closer I am to the ground, and then lightening the stroke as I approach the top of the trees. I'm working hard to allow the brush to do the work and not myself, so that the branches are random. I'm taking time to remember that the branches don't always just go up, they also go to the sides. Giving the viewer some suggestion that these are not just blobs of green, but that these blobs of green are being held up by these branches and trunks, limbs going everywhere. When we observe these in the outdoors as we're painting, we notice how many of the branches we do actually see. Painting a number of them is important to provide more realism. I'm remembering what I learned from other artists. The number of trees needs to be an odd number: 3, 5, 7. If we use even numbers, it creates a sort of tension in the work. We notice the pattern and it becomes distracting. It's more pleasing to the eye to look at shapes and to find odd numbers. I'm careful to pull some of the branches up past the green. In nature, so many tree limbs are seen without leaves at the very top as they begin to poke out and to grow, and that new growth is represented there. I have 3 major clumps of green trees, and now, as you notice, I'm making sure that there's an odd number of these larger trunks being drawn from the ground up, and then making sure there's plenty of variety in extending the smaller limbs out into the green, to the leaves that they are holding up. Even now, with these few strokes, you can see the painting coming to life. Notice how real these shapes look, even though at the very beginning they were blobs. If I had stopped early, I would have never gotten to this point. While onlookers may see those early signs and suggest, oh, this is someone who's not a professional painter, they would be wrong. Oftentimes, our paintings look ugly until we, at the very end, final act, start putting on the details. Here I'm working on the last clump of trees and putting in more limbs. This one's a little smaller and set back just a little bit from the others, and so I didn't want to highlight too much there. I want the viewer's eyes now to go more towards my center focus, which will be the middle clump of trees and the paths between those trees. I'm now taking that same brown mixture and making sure that at the very base of the trunk, you get the suggestion that the trunk is actually attached to the ground, not floating on top. I'm doing that for all 3 groupings of trees. I'm now adding some of that to the foreground, thinking about how sticks, weeds. This is not a manicured lawn that we're looking at. This gives us the illusion of some of the details, which will be closer to the viewer. A variety of little shapes, a splash of color here or there, helps the reader's eyes come into the painting, with the illusion of taller grasses, wildflowers, even the beginning of shrubs and trees. I've looked over some of the details and I'm now trying to further develop some problem areas that I see. At this point, I'm noticing that I believe that the sky is done, that the predominant shapes of the trees have now come to life. I'm still now thinking about the land plane, how to provide more of a focal image. Where do I want the viewer's eyes to go? Yes, I want them to go towards this middle clump, but the middle clump does not stand out yet enough to really call the viewer's attention. I'm now going to begin experimenting with some lighter colors, with different strokes, mixing on the canvas. Putting those colors where the focal point is. Suggesting further the trail that leads the viewer into the painting from the foreground to the horizon plane. Once again, I'm taking time to step back, observe the composition and the colors, the tonal values, making decisions on the palette before committing to the painting now. This is a crucial time in the painting. Too many details in one section of the painting could cause us to lose the central focal point, causing the viewer to wander almost aimlessly because too much of the painting calls attention to itself, or not giving enough detail to really produce a focal point. Both extremes I do not want in this painting. I've decided that we need more distance. So instead of adding any color, I'm taking a dry brush, firmly holding it, and drawing it across. I like the effect. It's creating a sense of real distance behind the trees, setting those colors back further. Do you see what I mean? How the focal points are coming further towards us? The three clumps of trees now stand more closely to us, whereas there is a sense in which those colors behind the tree are fading. I like that effect so much, I'm thinking about some of the lines and some of the variety in the landscape that's more towards the foreground. Trying to twist my brush in some random ways, but at the same time thinking about how the landmass moves some. There are mounds, there are low points, there are higher points. There are places where the trees are heavily embedded, places where the grass grows more readily. Once again, also thinking about how I might be able to use these color variations, these small little distractions, to help lead the viewer into the painting once more and towards my eventual focal point. Here's where I also begin to think about detail. Is there some detail that I want in this painting? Will this painting be only about the trees and the subtle variations of the landscape? Should I now include some elements from human life? Perhaps a human figure? Perhaps a utility pole? Telephone wires? A small building? What else would look good in this landscape? While I'm not convinced that we could just leave it alone, I decided to take a bolder move in this painting, adding some human elements. Those will come shortly. I'm thinking about laundry blowing in the wind. I'm thinking about the interaction between people and the land. What are some symbols that might be used for that? How about one of those large birdhouses? What about a picnic table covered with one of those plastic or paper tabletop cloths? I return to the foreground, thinking about the grasses and the variations. I'll work on that first. I'm only using a few brushes today. A few hog bristle flats, 2, 4, 6, and 8. A rigger. A couple of chip brushes. A standard palette knife, mainly used to mix the colors on the palette. At least today, I haven't been applying any with the palette knife. I have a couple of rounds, but haven't used them yet. Sometimes you have to begin to take a risk. Will the focal point be some kind of a tire swing off of this tree branch? I imagine. Now I begin to place it in. Not too happy with it. Doesn't seem to call enough attention. Try to create the tire. Not happy with the tire either. No worries. I'll take and dry my brush with a paper towel, taking as much paint off as I can. And now I'll take that same brush and lightly scrape it across that image I just painted. Essentially, I'm now erasing that element and starting off again. I'm satisfied that I've erased it completely. And now I can think of some other idea. This is when the laundry comes to mind again. I've decided I will string some laundry across the two trees, pulling the viewer in, helping them to think of the wind, the effects of the wind. I'm creating some more color mixtures on the palette. Sometimes you need a couple of gaps, especially now. A lot of detail is already in the painting. The sky plane looks good. I'm happy with the tree plane. The foreground still needs work. I want to add some shapes that help bring some detail to the long grasses and the various flowers. I realize at this point in the painting process that I can screw up the good work that I've done by putting too much detail in, or not enough. I want to make sure that each of these strokes is very deliberate. I take my rigger brush, using that mixture of ultramarine blue and burnt sienna. I'm now creating the line from the two trees. Oops, Mistake. Too close to the horizon line. What am I thinking? I erase. I need the line to be higher, separating part of that sky plane that you see in between the two tree groupings. This will catch the viewer's eye, and its trajectory is different than the horizon line, just slightly, but at least showing a difference, that we know this is in the air somehow and not part of the ground plane. What else do we need on the clothesline but clothes? I'm thinking about the colors, the straight colors that will call our attention. Bright white, titanium white, perhaps suggesting someone's t-shirt, or maybe a blanket. I'm thinking about other colors directly from the tube. What will give us a sense that this is clothing and not something else? I apply a couple of colors. Nothing more than a brief brush stroke. And yet somehow they convince us that it could be a pair of pants. A work uniform. Something deliberately put in the landscape by people. Yet I will not be painting people today. I want the subtle effect of knowing that people do live here on this landscape. A little bit of yellow, a little bit of red. I'm thinking about the color choices of the clothing and how they will impact the overall appearance of the painting. I decide to cover the clothesline with clothes. Here's a blanket. I'm looking and noticing that the titanium white is cold and harsh. I will need to take a shop towel or paper napkin and begin to take down a little bit of that white color of the titanium white so it reads a little bit more natural and not so cold. Pretty soon you'll see me take the paper towel and dab those two areas of white on the clothesline, dulling the finish, making it more realistic, and yet still drawing the viewer's eye to my focal point, the set of trees in the middle. I'm thinking about what else might the landscape reveal. I'm thinking about a wood bench. I'm getting the main structure of the bench. I'm remembering that it should be darker underneath the tabletop, as the table itself creates a shadow underneath it. I'm thinking about the tablecloths that we often place on the tables. And I will eventually put a very thin one on top of the table to give it a sense of detail, even when there is none. I'm looking at the clothesline. I'm looking at the table. I'm growing more satisfied. I'm also realizing that it needs some balance now. On the left side of the painting, something that also holds the viewer in, not allowing them to escape to another painting in the room, but to hang out here for a while, looking, observing, wondering about this painting. I'm fairly satisfied with the painting at this point. I'm reviewing my work. Is there an area where there's just one color? Are there shapes that need to be broken down further to provide more realism? I'm thinking about all these questions as I scan the landscape and mix a few more mixtures of color on my palette. I've decided to put that birdhouse in. I take my palette knife, creating the pole that will hold up that birdhouse. I'm thinking of the ones that they create for martins. The box-shaped homes on top of the poles. And yet I'm also thinking I do not want bright colors here to distract people's attention. I already have a focal point. This is more of a barrier to keep the viewer inside of the painting and not let them go to the next painting on the wall. A painting I did not create. Here it is, the pole is in place. I'm thinking about that house. Too much detail doesn't sound correct. In just a few shapes, I want to make the suggestion known and then move on. There'll be other paintings, other details later on. Here I'm remembering that the top of the birdhouse should be a little darker than the body. For a moment, I'm thinking about an outdoor light. No, I'll go with a birdhouse. Taking another good look at the painting. What does it need? Creating some more detail with just the fewest of marks. I'm thinking about putting a barrel right next to the birdhouse. A burned barrel, perhaps. A barrel discarded by someone else. Certainly a barrel that's not new. A barrel that might suggest that something is missing, like an RV, a camper, a trailer home, something here in this gap between two trees. I settle on the martin house, the birdhouse, and now at the base of that birdhouse, a barrel. Not a new barrel, bright and red, distracting from the main painting. An old one, rusted, trash still needing to be collected. Just some other indication that there's life out here. People are going about their daily business, not spending much time in reflection or meditation on the landscape itself. I want to call some attention to that tragedy in this painting. Make the viewer think of it as a beautiful work. And yet, somehow clouded by human beings who add many items which make the landscape look less attractive, not more attractive. I'm looking over the details of the painting once more. I'm finalizing my last strokes. I'm even thinking about the signature. I use a rubber-tipped instrument that allows me to simply sign it right into the colors. I notice that the titanium white is too white, and so now I've taken a paper towel and just pressed it up against those two shapes to take off some of the titanium white and to dull the color, to warm it up a bit. I'm happy with it. I'll still need to sign it in just a moment. Perhaps a few details on the barrel. I'm still contemplating if there's something else needed. Some other detail. Is the focus point clear enough now? Is the attention drawn to the middle group of trees? I think so. I think viewers can come in from the bottom foreground or from the other side through the use of that clothesline. I'm signing it. I step back.